The bullet split the clay pigeon clean in half before the pieces even had time to tumble sideways through the hot August air, and every man standing along the shooting line at the 1882 New Mexico Territorial Fair went dead quiet in a way that said more than any words could have managed. Hazel Doyle lowered the Winchester rifle with the same calm a woman might use to set a teacup back on its saucer, and she did not look at the crowd. She did not look at the scoreboard where her name sat at the top in chalk letters that one of the fair officials had written with obvious reluctance. She kept her eyes on the next clay disc that the throwing arm was preparing to launch, and she breathed out slowly through her nose, the way her father had taught her to breathe when she was 8 years old, and the world felt too large and too loud, and too full of men who wanted to tell her what she could and could not do. The afternoon sun hung over the fairgrounds like a brand pressed into the sky, turning everything amber and dust-colored, and the smell of roasted corn and horse sweat and fresh-cut pine from the fair booths drifted across the shooting range in waves. The crowd had grown steadily over the last hour. It had started as a small gathering, a few dozen people who had wandered over from the livestock judging when word spread that a woman had signed her name to the shooting competition roster. Now there were well over 200 souls packed along the rope line, most of the men with their arms folded and their jaws set, most of the women with their hands pressed to their mouths and their eyes very wide. Hazel was 31 years old. She had brown hair the color of dark honey that she kept pinned under a wide-brimmed hat she had bought off a supply wagon 3 years ago. Her dress was simple, a faded blue cotton with a practical cut, and she wore boots that had seen better decades. There was nothing theatrical about her appearance, nothing that announced itself or demanded attention, and perhaps that was why the attention she received felt so sharp and so uncomfortable to witness. She was not performing. She was simply better than everyone else. She had arrived at the Territorial Fair in the company of her neighbor, a round-faced woman named Bessie Carpenter, who sold preserves and embroidered pillowcases at the crafts tent, and the two of them had walked the dusty main thoroughfare together, looking at the booths and the animals and the displays of agricultural achievement. Hazel had not planned to enter the shooting competition. She had paused at the registration table only because she saw that the entry fee was 25 cents and the first prize was $12, and $12 was the difference between a comfortable winter and a very hard one for a woman running a small cattle operation alone on 40 acres outside of Cimarron. The man behind the registration table had looked at her for a long time when she put her quarter down. "The men's competition begins at 2 o'clock, he had said. "I can read the sign," Hazel had replied, and she had waited. He had eventually written her name down slowly, with the expression of a man who had been asked to do something that violated his understanding of how the universe was organized. That had been 3 hours ago. Now she was in the final round, and she had outshot 9 men to get there, and the crowd was buzzing with the kind of energy that lives on the border between admiration and resentment. The clay disc launched. She tracked it, fired, hit it. The crowd exhaled. Her final competitor was a man named Dale Purcell, who was 28 and had won this same competition for 2 years running, and who had the kind of jaw that made people assume he was competent at things even before he demonstrated it. He was a good shot. He had made it to the final round legitimately, and Hazel had watched his technique with the detached appreciation of someone who understood the craft. He had a steady hand and a good eye, and he was going to lose. He lost. When the last disc was called and the final tally was announced, and the fair official read Hazel Doyle's name as the winner of the shooting competition, the silence that followed was enormous. It was the kind of silence that has texture to it that you can almost reach out and press your hand against. And then from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, someone started clapping. Not enthusiastically, not the way a crowd claps when it is swept up in a moment. This was deliberate. One pair of hands coming together slowly, measured, each clap landing with intention. Hazel turned her head. She could not immediately identify who it was. The crowd had parted slightly in reaction to the sound, that reflexive human movement toward or away from something unexpected. And through the gap she saw him standing at the very back of the gathered crowd with both hands raised and his palms meeting steadily. He was tall, wearing a dark coat over a white shirt with the collar open, and he had a hat pushed back on his head in a way that suggested he had forgotten it was there. He had dark hair and a beard that was several days past deliberate and several days before neglect. He was watching her with an expression she could not quite read from this distance. He clapped 7 times slowly, and then he stopped and put his hands in his coat pockets and looked at her with what appeared to be complete and total composure, as though he had decided some time ago that applauding was the correct response to excellence and was entirely comfortable having made that choice publicly and alone. Hazel held his gaze for 1 second. 2. And then the fair official was pressing $12 into her hand, and Dale Purcell was shaking her hand with the rigid courtesy of a man who had been raised properly, but was currently having a very difficult afternoon, and the moment dissolved into noise and movement, and Bessie was grabbing her arm and saying something excited that Hazel only half heard. She did not look back at where the man had been standing, but she thought about those slow, deliberate claps for the rest of the evening. His name was Matthew Walden, and he had come to the Territorial Fair for reasons that had nothing to do with shooting competitions, and everything to do with the fact that his surveying contract with the territorial government had brought him to this part of New Mexico 3 weeks ago, and he had needed supplies, and had heard the fair mentioned by someone at the general store in Cimarron, and had decided that a day away from the land charts and measurement stakes would do him good. He was 34 years old, and he had been a surveyor for 8 years, having learned the trade from an older man in Colorado who had seen something careful and precise in the way Matthew looked at the world, and had decided to cultivate it. Before that, he had driven cattle for 2 years, and before that he had done the kinds of jobs that a young man does in the West when he has no money and no particular plan: hauling freight, helping at a livery, working a harvest. He had grown up in Missouri, the second of 3 sons of a man who repaired clocks and a woman who taught school, and he had come west at 22 with $100 and no very clear idea of what he was looking for. He had never found a reason to settle anywhere for very long. He liked the work of surveying because it let him move through the land in a methodical way, drawing boundaries that would become real and permanent, creating order out of the undifferentiated sprawl of territory. He liked the precision of it, the way a well-done survey left no room for argument. He liked working outdoors, and he liked thinking, and he liked the companionship of a good campfire and a book at the end of the day. He did not think of himself as a lonely man, but if pressed, he would have admitted that there was a particular quality to his evenings that had begun to feel, over the last couple of years, like something was consistently missing from them. He had not pressed himself on the matter because he found that particular kind of introspection more uncomfortable than rewarding. He had watched the shooting competition from the back because he had arrived late, working his way through the crowd until the press of bodies made further progress seem rude. He had watched Hazel Doyle from that position for the last 40 minutes of the competition, and what he had seen had impressed him in a way that went well beyond the quality of her marksmanship, which was itself exceptional. What had impressed him was the way she held herself. The absence of performance, the complete self-containment, the focused economy of her movements. She was entirely in herself, entirely present in the task, and the crowd and its noise and its complicated feelings about her presence simply did not touch her. He had clapped because it seemed to him the correct and honest thing to do, and he was not in the habit of failing to do things simply because no one else was doing them. He had not expected her to find him in the crowd. He had not expected that brief, direct, assessing gaze. He had not expected it to land on him the way it did, like a hand placed flat against his chest. He found himself walking in the direction she had gone, which he recognized as slightly irrational, but found himself doing anyway. The evening portion of the fair brought lanterns out along the main thoroughfare, and the smell of supper cooking from the food stalls, and the sound of a fiddle starting up somewhere near the dance platform. Hazel had used 2 of her 12 prize dollars to buy Bessie a proper supper and herself, a cup of coffee and a piece of cornbread, and they sat on a wooden bench near the food stalls, and Bessie talked with great animation about everything that had happened while Hazel ate her cornbread and thought about winter feed costs, and whether the north pasture fence needed to be replaced before the cold came. "That man has been looking at you," Bessie said, without lowering her voice in the slightest. Hazel did not look up from her coffee. "Which man?" "The tall one in the dark coat. He was standing by the lantern post, but now he is pretending to look at the pie contest display and making a very poor job of pretending." Hazel looked up. He was indeed making a poor job of pretending to look at the pie contest display. He was standing with his profile to her, looking at the ribboned pies with the expression of a man reading a language he only partially understood, and he had the quality of someone who knew he was being observed and had decided the most dignified response was to remain still and let the moment resolve itself. "That is the man who clapped," Hazel said. "What man who clapped?" "At the end of the competition, when my name was announced and everyone went quiet, a man at the back started clapping slowly." "That man." Bessie looked at Matthew Walden with considerable interest. "He was clapping for you. He was clapping for the shooting. I think he would have clapped for anyone who shot that well." "Maybe," Bessie said, in the tone of a woman who thought maybe was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. "But you were the one doing the shooting." Matthew Walden chose that moment to give up the pretense of the pie display. He turned, and because she was already looking at him, they saw each other directly and simultaneously, and there was a moment of mutual recognition that had nothing theatrical about it and everything honest. He walked toward them with an even stride, taking his hat off when he was still several feet away, which was the kind of manners that registered. "I hope I am not intruding," he said. "I wanted to offer my congratulations. My name is Matthew Walden." Up close she could see that his eyes were a very dark gray, the color of river water before rain. There were lines at the corners from squinting in the sun, and his hands, she noticed automatically because she had always been someone who noticed hands, were the hands of someone who worked outdoors, calloused and capable and steady. "Hazel Doyle," she said. "This is my neighbor, Bessie Carpenter." Bessie said, "How do you do?" with considerable warmth. "That was some of the finest shooting I have seen," Matthew said to Hazel directly, "and I have seen a fair amount. Have you competed yourself?" "Not formally. I was a rancher's hand for a time, drove cattle. You learn to shoot well enough." "But there is a difference between shooting well enough and what you were doing out there this afternoon." Hazel looked at him steadily. She had been receiving compliments from men her entire life, and she had developed a reliable sense for the various kinds. There was the patronizing kind that was really a form of astonishment dressed up in praise. There was the calculated kind that was paving a road toward something else. There was the reflexive kind that men offered because they had been raised to be agreeable and did not know what else to say. What Matthew Walden was offering was none of those. He was simply saying what he had observed, with the straightforward delivery of someone who found accuracy more natural than flattery. "My father taught me," she said. "He believed there was no reason a person's ability to defend themselves should depend on their sex." "He was right," Matthew said, with such simplicity that she almost smiled. "Would you like to sit down?" Bessie asked, gesturing at the bench with the aggressive hospitality of a woman who had already decided she approved of this development. Matthew glanced at Hazel, making it her decision. She moved slightly on the bench, which was invitation enough. He sat, and the three of them talked in the easy way of people who find conversation coming without effort. Matthew asked Bessie about her preserves, and listened to the answer with genuine attention. He asked Hazel about her cattle operation, and she answered him with the specific practical language of someone who actually runs cattle rather than someone who talks about running cattle. and she could see that he knew the difference because he asked the right follow-up questions. She learned that he was a surveyor, that he had been contracted by the territorial government to complete a boundary survey in the Cimarron region, that he would be in the area for at least another 6 weeks. 6 weeks, Bessie said. That is a good long time. It is a substantial job, Matthew said. The fiddle music from the dance platform grew louder, joined now by a banjo, and the sound of it carried easily through the warm evening air. Couples were moving onto the platform, and the lantern light made everything golden and soft at the edges. "Are you a widow, Mrs. Doyle?" Matthew asked, and the directness of it might have been rude from someone else, but from him it had the quality of a man who preferred to understand the ground he was standing on. "Yes," Hazel said, 3 years now. I am sorry for your loss. His name was Thomas. He was a good man, and I miss him. He died of a fever very quickly. The cattle operation was his originally, but I kept it running." She said this last part not with pride exactly, but with a matter-of-fact quality that said she had made a decision and carried it out and did not require anyone's opinion on whether she should have. "I would imagine," Matthew said, "that keeping a cattle operation running alone for 3 years is not a small thing." "It is not," she agreed, "but it is mine." He nodded, and she could see that he understood what she meant, that the ownership of the thing was not simply financial, but was something more essential, something about the continuity of a life, the refusal to be swept away by circumstances. They stayed at the fair until nearly 9 o'clock, which was late for a weeknight, and when Bessie began yawning in that pointed way that people do when they are ready to leave, Hazel stood and straightened her hat and offered her hand to Matthew Walden. He shook it the way one adult shakes the hand of another adult, firmly, without any of the excessive gentleness that men sometimes applied to women's hands, as though they were fragile objects. "Good evening, Mr. Walden," she said. "Good evening, Mrs. Doyle." He paused. "I will be working in the Cimarron region for the next 6 weeks. If it would not be impertinent to say so, I would be glad to see you again." She considered him for a moment in the way she had been considering the shooting line all afternoon, with that same clear, undecorated attention. "My property is on the North Road, 3 miles out of town. You will see the name on the gate." She turned and walked away with Bessie, and she did not look back, and she was aware that she wanted to and chose not to. And that small act of self-discipline felt important in a way she could not entirely articulate. "Well," Bessie said when they were out of earshot. "Do not," Hazel said. "I did not say anything. You were going to." "I was going to say that he seemed like a very decent man," Bessie said with the injured dignity of the innocent, "which is only an observation." Hazel said nothing. But she kept the image of those slow, deliberate claps in the back of her mind all the way home through the dark New Mexico night. And she thought about gray eyes the color of river water before rain, and she thought about hands that were calloused and capable and steady. 4 days passed before he came. She was mending a section of fence along the east side of the property, working in the early morning before the heat of the day made outdoor labor miserable, when she heard hoofbeats on the road and looked up to see a sorrel horse coming at an easy trot. The rider had his hat on properly today, and he sat a horse well, with the relaxed uprightness of someone who had spent real time in the saddle. Matthew Walden pulled up when he saw her, and he did not call out or wave but simply guided the horse to where she was working and dismounted, and tied the reins to the top rail of the fence she was mending. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. She had a fence staple between her teeth and a pair of wire pliers in her hand, and she was aware of being entirely unimpressive to look at in her work clothes with her hair coming loose from its pins in the heat, and she found that she did not care, and the not caring felt good. "Are you working that section or replacing it?" he asked, looking at the fence. "Working it. The post is solid enough, but 2 of the wire runs are pulling free. Can I give you a hand?" She handed him the wire pliers without ceremony, and they worked the fence together for the next 2 hours in a companionship that required very little talking, because the work itself provided structure and conversation emerged naturally around it. He had clearly worked fences before. He did not fumble with the pliers or try to do things in the wrong order. He was useful, which was something she valued above nearly every other quality in a person. "What brought you out this way?" she asked when they had finished the worst section and were straightening up in the brightening morning. "I needed to recalibrate my survey instruments, and I cannot do it properly until I establish a baseline from a known point. The northeast corner marker of your property is one of the registered reference points in the old survey records. The iron stake by the cottonwood at the creek bend," she said. "That is the one. I was planning to locate it this morning. Thought I would stop and see if you were agreeable to it. The creek is on common ground. The stake is on your side of it technically." "I have no objection." "Thank you." He paused and she could see him deciding something. "Would you like to come along? The walk out there is not unpleasant." She looked at the sky, still early. The cattle were watered, the morning chores were done. She had planned to spend the rest of the morning going over her account ledger, which was something she needed to do but not something she was looking forward to. "All right," she said. They walked the property together for nearly 3 hours. Matthew carried his surveying equipment, a transit and a set of measurement chains and a field notebook, and he worked methodically, stopping at intervals to take readings and make notes, explaining what he was doing in a clear and practical way that she found she enjoyed because he did not simplify it for her. He talked about land surveying the way she talked about cattle management, as someone for whom the subject was genuinely interesting and not merely a job. She talked about the property in return, its history and its particular qualities, the springs that ran reliable in every season, the sections where the grass came in thick and where it came in thin and why, the way the weather moved through from the west and what that meant for planning work around it. They were at the creek bend, Matthew kneeling beside the old iron survey stake taking measurements, when she asked him where he had come from originally. "Missouri," he said. "Small town east of Kansas City. My father repaired clocks." "A clockmaker," she said, and for some reason that detail charmed her. Clock repairman specifically. He had a gift for broken things. He could listen to a clock and hear where the fault was, the way a doctor listens to a chest and hears where the trouble is. Matthew looked up from his notebook. He always said the trick was paying attention. Most people look at a broken thing and see the break. He looked at it and listened to what the whole mechanism was trying to do, and then he understood where it had gone wrong. "You were close to him," she said. "Very. He died 5 years ago. My mother is still in Missouri, still teaching school. She is 70 and she still teaches the youngest grades, and she will probably do it until the day she dies." "That is a woman who knows what she is," Hazel said with approval. "She does. She has always known." He wrote something in his notebook. "Did your father know what he was?" The question surprised her pleasantly, the reciprocity of it, the interest it implied. "He was a man who believed the world was more fair than it was," she said, thinking it through as she said it. "He taught me to shoot and to read and to do mathematics and to value my own opinion. He thought those things would be enough. He did not account for the amount of energy it takes to insist on being treated as a person when the world has decided you are something less. But you have insisted." "I have. I am tired of it sometimes, but I have." He looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes that saw things directly. "I think you must be very strong," he said. "Not in the way people say to women when they mean resilient under suffering. I mean strong in the way that counts, the kind that knows its own mind." She felt something shift slightly inside her at that. The way the light shifts when a cloud moves, and suddenly everything looks a little different than it did before. She turned to look at the creek because she needed a moment to breathe. They walked back to the house in the late morning, the sun properly up now and the shadow of every rock and fence post going thin and straight, and at the gate he untied his horse and she stood with one hand on the post. "I generally have coffee around 3 in the afternoon," she said. "If you are out this way again." "That is good to know," he said. He came back 2 days later at 3 in the afternoon, and they drank coffee on the porch and talked for 2 hours, and after that it became a pattern. Not every day. sometimes every other day, sometimes with 3 days between. But regular, like the measurement of something. He became familiar with the rhythms of her property. He knew which of the cattle were the most difficult and which were placid. He learned where the good spring was and where the ground went boggy after rain. She became familiar with his survey territory, heard about the various landmarks he was mapping, and the occasional difficulty of getting a clear line of sight through the cedar growth along the ridge. They talked about politics, about the territory's ongoing bid for statehood, about the railroads and what they were doing to the land and the communities along their routes. Hazel had opinions on all of these things, and she delivered them without apology. And Matthew listened and responded and sometimes disagreed. And those disagreements were bracing and honest, and she found herself looking forward to them because there was nothing more invigorating than a good argument with someone who actually had something to say. 3 weeks into what had become, quietly and without announcement, a courtship, Matthew arrived at 3 o'clock to find Hazel sitting on the porch steps with a ledger book open across her knees and an expression on her face that he had not seen before. "What is it?" he said, tying his horse. She looked up. "Sit down." He sat on the step beside her, close enough that she could have reached out and touched him without extending her arm, and she turned the ledger so he could see the column of numbers. "I am $22 short on my winter feed order," she said. "I had planned that the prize money from the shooting competition would cover it, and I used $2 at the fair, which I knew, and I had $10 set aside from the cattle sales in July. But the grain prices have come up since I last checked, and I am $22 short." "What are your options?" he asked, looking at the numbers. She appreciated that he did not immediately offer her money. He looked at the problem. "I can reduce the herd by selling 3 or 4 head before winter, which will lower my spring capacity. Or I can take a short-term note at the bank in Cimarron, which will cost me interest I cannot really afford. Or I can find some other source of income between now and October." "What are the opportunities for that in Cimarron?" "The hotel sometimes hires laundresses, but that work will take time away from the property. The schoolhouse is looking for a teacher for the winter term, which would pay better, but I would have to be in town 5 days a week, and the cattle would suffer for it." Matthew was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need a base camp established at the northeast corner of the survey area for the last 3 weeks of work. I have been sleeping out there or riding the 6 miles each way, which is impractical in either direction. I need someone to provide board, meals and a place to sleep and stable access for the horse. The territorial government will pay $2 a day for that service. 21 days at $2 is $42. She looked at him. "That would more than cover your feed order," he said. "Would that be appropriate?" she asked, not prudishly but practically. She knew what people would say. "Your neighbor Bessie Carpenter is aware of your situation and mine," he said. "I thought she might serve as chaperone if you would permit it. She mentioned to me last week that she had been meaning to spend some time with you before winter." Hazel looked at him for a long moment. "You talked to Bessie about this?" "I wanted to have a practical solution ready before I proposed it." "You planned this," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite anger and not quite amusement but lived in the territory between them. "I planned a solution to a problem I could see developing," he said carefully. "I am a surveyor. I tend to look ahead and plan for what the terrain requires." It was quiet. Then she said, $2 a day is the territorial rate." "It is. And Bessie would stay in the guest room. If she was agreeable." "She will be agreeable. She has been looking for an excuse to get away from her husband's brother who has been visiting for a month." Hazel closed the ledger. "All right. You can move your equipment to the barn on Monday and take the small room off the kitchen. Bessie can come Tuesday." Something warm moved through his eyes, quickly restrained. "Thank you, Mrs. Doyle." "Hazel," she said, "if you are going to eat at my table, you should use my name." He looked at her with that direct, undecorated attention that she had come to associate specifically with him. "Hazel," he said. "Matthew," she replied. That was 3 weeks after the fair, and it was the moment that something that had been building between them found its name without either of them speaking it aloud. He moved his equipment to the barn on Monday as arranged, and Bessie arrived Tuesday morning with a carpet bag and an expression of tremendous personal satisfaction that she did not make the least effort to conceal. She settled into the guest room and immediately made herself useful in the kitchen, which Hazel appreciated, and she kept Hazel company in the evenings while Matthew worked on his field notes by lamplight at the kitchen table, and the three of them existed together with the ease of people who suited each other. Matthew ate breakfast and supper at the house and took his midday meal out in the field. He rode out before first light and came back in the early evening with dust on his coat and his notebook full of the day's measurements. He always washed up before coming inside, which Hazel noticed, and he always asked if there was anything that needed doing before he sat down at the table, which she also noticed. And when she said yes, which she did 3 times in the first week, he did the thing she asked without making it into something either reluctant or eagerly performed. The evenings were the best part. After supper, which Hazel cooked and Bessie helped with and Matthew cleaned up after, they sat in the main room, Bessie with her mending, Hazel with whatever needed her attention, Matthew with his notes or a book, and they talked the kind of easy talk that fills up a room pleasantly without requiring anything from anyone. The day's events and observations, things read and thought about, memories that surfaced naturally in conversation. One evening at the end of the second week, Bessie excused herself early, yawning genuinely this time, and it was just the two of them in the lamplight and the settled silence of the house. Hazel was reading a 2-week-old newspaper she had gotten from the general store, and Matthew was making corrections to one of his survey maps, and for a long time neither of them spoke, and the quiet was not empty but full. "Can I ask you something personal?" Matthew said without looking up from the map. "You can ask," Hazel said. He set his pencil down and looked at her. "You said Thomas was a good man. Do you miss the marriage or do you miss him specifically?" She put the newspaper down and thought about it honestly, which was her habit. "Both," she said, "but they are different kinds of missing. Missing him is a specific ache, the particular person he was, his laugh, the way he thought about things. Missing the marriage is different. It is missing having a person who is oriented toward the same future as you, someone who knows your life from the inside." "That is a very precise way to put it," Matthew said. "You asked a precise question." He was quiet for a moment. "I have never been married. I have been close once, a woman in Colorado. We were very fond of each other, but when it came to it, we were oriented toward different futures. She wanted to stay and I could not see staying. It was not the right thing and we both knew it." "Was it sad?" "Yes. Honest sadness, though. The clean kind." She understood what he meant, that some sadness comes from loss and some comes from relief, and the ones that mix the two are the honest ones because they tell you the truth about what the situation actually was. "Do you want to marry again?" he asked, and it was direct enough that it stopped the air in the room for a moment. She looked at him. He was looking back with that gray-eyed steadiness that she had come to think of as particularly his, the quality of a man who asked questions because he needed the answers, not because he wanted to hear himself asking. "I want to choose carefully," she said. "I am not lonely enough to choose poorly." "That is a good standard," he said. "And you?" she asked, because the question was equal and she believed in equal. "I want the same thing," he said. "I have spent a great deal of time in my own company and I am not afraid of it, but I am aware that some of what I thought was contentment might have been only the absence of a better alternative." She looked at him for a long time. Outside, the summer crickets were at full volume and the lamp made the room small and warm and close. "Matthew," she said. "Hazel. I think you should know that I have thought about you considerably more than I have thought about most people I have met in recent years." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "I think about you very nearly all of the time." She stood up from her chair and crossed the room and sat in the chair closer to him, the one Bessie usually used, and they were 3 feet apart and looking at each other plainly and without pretense. We should proceed carefully, she said. I agree completely. I have a life here that I have built and that matters to me. I will not dismantle it for a feeling. I would not ask you to. And I have not known you very long. 6 weeks and some days, he said. No, that is not long. But I find, she said, choosing her words with the care she gave to things that mattered, that I am willing to keep knowing you, and that is more than I have been willing to offer anyone in 3 years, so I thought you should know that. He reached across the small distance between them and put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair, just placed it there, quietly, the way you might cover something you want to protect without pressing too hard. I will not waste what you are offering, he said. She turned her hand over beneath his and they sat like that, his hand in hers in the lamplight, with the crickets loud outside and the house settled around them. And it was the most quietly perfect moment she had experienced in 3 years, and she let herself feel it without trying to be cautious about it. Bessie Carpenter claimed for the rest of her life that she had not been listening at the hallway door, and everyone who knew her understood that this was not the kind of claim one could fully verify. The next morning was different. Not uncomfortably so, but different the way mornings are different when something has shifted in the night that cannot be shifted back. Matthew was at breakfast before she came downstairs, and when she came into the kitchen he looked at her directly, and she looked back, and they both understood without saying it that the previous evening had been real. Bessie served the eggs with the bright eyes of a woman who knew exactly what was what. A week before his survey contract was due to end, they rode together on a Sunday into the foothills north of the property to check on a section of Hazel's range that she wanted to inspect before winter. It was the first time they had been genuinely alone together, away from the house and Bessie's benevolent supervision, and the open air of the landscape had a clarifying effect. They rode side by side on a trail that went up through pinyon and juniper, and emerged on a flat open shelf of land where you could see for 40 miles in 3 directions, the whole Cimarron Valley laid out below in its tawny autumn colors, the mountains to the north still showing their summer green but going dusky at the edges. Hazel dismounted and walked to the edge of the shelf and stood looking out at the view, and Matthew dismounted and came to stand beside her, and neither of them said anything for a considerable time because the view did not require commentary. When the survey contract ends, she said finally, what are your plans? There is work in Colorado, he said. A railroad survey along the southern route. I have been in correspondence with the company about it. She nodded, looking at the valley. I have also, he said carefully, been thinking about whether there might be reasons to decline that contract. She turned to look at him. There is county surveying work here in Colfax County, he said. Smaller work and not as well paid. But the Territorial Land Office has been trying to get someone to take it on for 2 years and no one has wanted to settle in one place long enough. You would settle, she said. If I had reason to. He was looking at her with complete attention. Hazel, I am not a man who says things he does not mean. And I am aware that 6 weeks and some days is not long, and that I have no right to ask anything of you. But I am also a man who is good at surveying a situation and understanding its features, and I can see clearly that what is here between us is something I do not want to walk away from. Matthew, she said, I am not proposing anything immediately. I want to be clear about that because I know you said you want to proceed carefully, and I believe that is right. I am saying that I would like your permission to come back, to write if you are willing, to court you properly if that is a thing you would consider. She looked out at the valley for a long moment, the 40 miles of it, the ancient, ungovernable, beautiful land. You should know, she said, that I will never stop having opinions about things. I am counting on it, he said with a sincerity that made her laugh, and I will always manage my own property. I would not have it any other way, and I will outshoot you every single time. He smiled then, and it transformed his face completely in the way of smiles that come from somewhere unguarded, genuine, and unhurried. That, he said, I have no doubt about whatsoever. She turned back to the view. Write to me from Colorado, she said, and come back in the spring. "I will write," he said, "and I will come back." He came very close then, and she turned to face him, and he put his hands on her face with an extraordinary gentleness, those capable surveyor's hands that she had been noticing since the first evening at the fair, and he kissed her with the same quality she had come to associate with everything he did, deliberate and unhurried and entirely honest. The autumn light was golden on the valley below them, and the wind moved through the piñon trees with a sound like distant water, and she put her hands against his chest and kissed him back without reservation because she had decided, in the way she made all her decisions, clearly and fully, and without looking back. He left 4 days later, on a bright October morning with his horse loaded, and his survey equipment packed, and his coat collar turned up against the early chill. Bessie had gone home the previous week, leaving the house quiet and Hazel's mornings with a space in them that had a specific shape. He shook her hand at the gate, which was formal and also private, their own small acknowledgement that formality between them now had a particular meaning. "Write soon," she said. "First town I reach," he said, and then, because it was simply true, "I am going to miss you very considerably." "I know," she said. "I am going to miss you very considerably as well." He rode down the north road, and she watched him until he was a small dark shape against the pale dust, and then she went inside and did not stand at the window because she was not the kind of person who stood at windows. She sat down and wrote him a letter instead. His first letter reached her in 2 weeks, from a town in southern Colorado, written in a hand that was precise and small on the page, the handwriting of someone accustomed to fitting a great deal into a limited space. He described the Colorado landscape, the higher country and the different quality of the light. He described the railroad survey team he was working with, the various personalities involved, the particular challenges of the terrain. He told her about a conversation he had had with a Ute elder near the survey boundary, an old man who had watched the railroad survey with dark and knowing eyes and said, in Spanish because that was the language they shared, that the land remembered everything done to it, and that the new lines people were drawing on maps did not change what the land knew about itself. Matthew wrote that he had thought about this for several days and found he could not disagree. He asked after her cattle and her fence repairs and Bessie, and at the end of the letter, in the precise, unadorned way that characterized him, he wrote, "I think about our afternoon on the ridge most days. I thought you should know that." She read that last line 4 times, which she would not have admitted to anyone. She wrote back the following morning, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, and she wrote him about the property, the preparations for winter, the 3 calves that had been born late and would need particular attention through the cold months. She wrote about a conversation she had had at the general store in Cimarron with one of the town councilmen who had been condescending about her water rights, and whom she had corrected very thoroughly, using chapter and verse from the Territorial Water Law, which she had looked up specifically for this purpose. She told him that the ridgeline looked very fine in the early autumn light, and that she had ridden up there once since he left. She added at the end, because she was not the kind of person who was dishonest about things, "I find the evenings quieter than I would prefer. I am glad you are going to come back in the spring." They wrote to each other every 2 weeks through October and November and December, and the letters grew longer as winter deepened. He told her about the survey work and about the Colorado winter, and about books he was reading. She told him about managing the cattle through the cold, and about the territorial politics she followed in the newspaper, and about a difficult situation with a neighboring rancher named Ed Craddock who had decided, in Thomas's absence, that certain grazing agreements they had made verbally were no longer binding. When she wrote to him about Craddock, Matthew's response was longer than usual and very careful in its construction. He did not suggest that she needed anyone to deal with the situation for her. He asked good practical questions about what documentation existed for the original agreement and who had witnessed it, and he mentioned that his mother had faced a similar situation with a landlord after his father died, and had resolved it through the county land records office. This led Hazel to look up the Colfax County records, where she found that the grazing agreement had been registered as a land use agreement in 1878 and was therefore legally binding, and she presented this information to Ed Craddock on a cold February morning with such precision and confidence that he agreed to honor it without further argument. She told Matthew about this in her next letter, and he wrote back, "I knew you would find the right tool for that. I was not concerned, but I am glad it is resolved." She found that she loved his letters, the way he thought on the page, the precision of his language, and also the warmth that lived underneath it. She had not expected warmth from him, not because he was cold, but because he was so contained, so self-sufficient in the way that some people are who have spent a great deal of time in their own company. But warmth was there in his letters, measured and genuine, the warmth of a person who had found someone they could direct it toward. January was hard, the hardest month, cold and long and relentless, with the cattle needing constant attention, and the days very short and the house very quiet. Bessie came for a week in mid-January, and they sat by the stove and talked and played cards, and Hazel was grateful for it. She was not lonely in the way she had been in the first year after Thomas died, that acute raw loneliness, but she was aware of wanting spring in a way that went beyond the desire for warm weather. Matthew's January letters were longer than usual. He wrote about Missouri and his childhood winters, the way the Missouri River looked when it froze. He wrote about his father again, a memory of being 10 years old and watching his father work on an ornate French clock that a wealthy family had sent him, his hands moving with extraordinary delicacy inside the mechanism, and the feeling young Matthew had had that his father could hear things other people could not. He wrote about what it was to be good at something, not famous or celebrated but genuinely skilled, and the particular satisfaction of that. He wrote in the last paragraph of the January letter, "I am coming back in March if the weather allows, and April at the latest. I want you to know that I am not coming back simply to resume surveying. I am coming back because there is a life I want to build, and I have understood over these months that the life I want to build includes you in it in a permanent way. I have never said that to anyone. I want you to know it." She sat with that letter in her hands for a long time by the stove. Then she went to her desk and wrote him a letter that was longer than any she had written before, and she told him things she had not told anyone in 3 years, about what it had been like to lose Thomas, about the particular fear of a solitary life that was not unhappy but was somehow incomplete, about the years of defending her choices and her property and her competence and the exhaustion of it, and about the fair in August, the clay pigeons splitting in the hot air, and a man at the back of the crowd clapping slowly, and how that had stayed with her. She wrote, "I have been careful because I know the cost of choosing poorly. But I want you to understand that I have not been cautious about you. I have been clear-eyed and deliberate, and I have seen you as you are, and what I see is someone I want to build toward as well. Come in March if you can manage it." He arrived on the 14th of March, which was a Sunday, and the New Mexico winter had broken 2 weeks early, and the land had that tentative new green of early spring, grass coming in thin and bright under the pale blue sky. She was at the gate when he came up the north road, not because she had been waiting there, but because she had seen him coming from the kitchen window and had walked out without entirely thinking about it. He dismounted before he reached the gate and walked the rest of the way, leading his horse, and he stopped at the gate and looked at her, and she looked at him. He looked the same and also different, the difference that comes from knowing someone better through letters than you knew them in person, so that the person you see has more depth than the person you last saw. He was perhaps a little thinner from the Colorado winter, and he had cut his hair, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not contained at all. "Hazel," he said. "Matthew," she said, and she opened the gate. He came through, and without any preamble, without the careful, measured progress of the previous autumn, he put his arms around her and she went into them, and they held each other in the March morning with the horse nosing at the gate posts and the new grass coming in around their boots, and it was nothing like performance and everything like relief. "Hello," he said, into her hair. "Hello," she said, against his shoulder. They stayed like that for a long moment, just breathing, just the solidity of another person after months of letters, and then she stepped back and looked at him and he looked at her. "Come inside," she said. "I have coffee." He sat at her kitchen table as though he had never left it, and she poured coffee, and outside the spring light moved across the kitchen floor in its slow way, and they talked for 3 hours without effort. He had accepted the Colfax County surveying position. He told her that in the first hour directly, because that was how he did things. He had declined the railroad contract and written to the county land office, and the position was his. He would have permanent work in the county based out of Cimarron at a salary that was modest but reliable. "That is good work," she said. "Permanent county work is stable." "It is, and it keeps me in one place." He looked at her across the table. "I want to ask you something, Hazel." "Ask it," she said. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not immediately if you need more time, but I want to ask it clearly so you know where I stand. I want to be your husband. I want to be oriented toward the same future as you." She recognized her own words from the autumn and loved him for remembering them. She looked at her coffee. She looked at the kitchen, at the familiar objects of her daily life, the stove and the shelves and the window that looked out at her property. She thought about Thomas, who had been a good man and deserved to be thought about honestly, and she thought about what he would have made of Matthew Walden and thought he would have liked him very much, because Thomas had always liked men who were competent and direct and said what they meant. "Yes," she said. "Not immediately, as you say, but yes." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I want to stay here," she said. "On the property. This is my home and I will not leave it." "I know. I would not ask you to. You can bring your things. What is mine is both of ours, and what is both of ours will be managed by both of us. Together." "I would not have it any other way," he said, and he meant it. They were married in Cimarron in May, at the small Methodist church, with Bessie Carpenter as her witness and a man from Matthew's survey crew as his. The ceremony was simple, and the vows were the traditional ones, but Hazel had added a line to hers that the minister had raised his eyebrows at but ultimately allowed, that she brought to the marriage her whole self, including her property and her opinions and her ability to outshoot anyone in the territory, and she intended to keep all three. There had been quiet laughter from the small gathering of witnesses, and Matthew had looked at her with those gray eyes warm and steady, and had promised to love her for exactly who she was, which was what she required. The reception was held at Bessie's house, a simple affair with good food and the fiddle player from the fair, the same one, brought in for the occasion, and Hazel danced for the first time since before Thomas died, with Matthew's hand at her waist and his eyes on her face, and the fiddle making the air feel like summer. That night back at the property that was now theirs together, they sat on the porch in the May warmth and the stars were very bright over the New Mexico landscape, very clear and very close, and she leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her and they were quiet in the particular way of two people who have found each other across a distance and know the value of it. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Yes," she said without qualification. "Are you?" "More than I expected to be," he said honestly. "Which is more than I thought possible 6 months ago." She looked up at the stars. "I was not expecting you," she said. "That is the thing, I was not expecting anything. I had my property and my life, and I was not expecting a tall man in a dark coat to stand at the back of a crowd and clap slowly." He laughed, a real laugh, and she felt it in his chest against her shoulder. "You looked at me like I was the strangest thing you had ever seen," he said. "You were doing something strange," she said. "Everyone else was silent and you were clapping as though you had decided something." "I had decided something," he said. "I had decided that what you did out there deserved to be acknowledged regardless of what anyone else was doing." She turned to look at him in the dark, his profile against the star-filled sky. "That is who you are," she said. "I suppose it is." She settled back against his shoulder. I am glad that is who you are." The summer came in full and hot and beautiful, and Matthew established his office for the county work in a corner of the house that Hazel had been using for storage, and they cleared it out together, and fitted it with his drafting table and his maps and his surveying instruments in their worn wooden cases. She liked seeing his things in the house, the evidence of his life and his work integrated with hers, the maps on the wall next to her ranch accounts, the orderly tools of two people's very different but complementary trades. He rode out for the county work 4 or 5 days a week, and came home in the evenings with dust on his coat and his notebook full, and she managed the cattle operation with the same hands-on thoroughness she always had, and they met at the supper table and talked about their days with the genuine interest of people who found each other's work actually interesting. He helped with the cattle when the work called for it, learning the rhythms of the operation with the methodical attention he brought to everything. She learned to read his survey maps, the particular language of the contour lines and the benchmark notations, and occasionally accompanied him on field days when the property management allowed it, walking the land with him in that measuring, attentive way, learning to see the landscape the way he saw it. The neighboring rancher Craddock remained difficult in the way of men who have decided on a grievance and will not relinquish it, but he confined his difficulty to dark looks and muttered complaints at the general store, because Matthew Walden's presence in the household had clarified for him that the legal and social situation was not going to shift in his favor. Hazel found this both satisfying and mildly irritating, the satisfaction being that the problem was resolved and the irritation being that a man's presence had resolved what her own clear legal argument should have resolved without it. She said as much to Matthew one evening. "You are right," he said simply. "It is not fair. It should not be that way. But you have the result you need, and in the spring when the county work takes me to the eastern section, you will handle Craddock precisely as well as you would handle him if I were here." "I know I will," she said. "I know you know. I am just saying it." She shook her head, but she was smiling. In September, the same month as the previous year's fair but a full 12 months after the first one, she realized with a certainty that settled over her slowly, and then all at once that she was expecting a child. She told Matthew on a Thursday evening after supper in the kitchen, with the lamp lit and his map spread across the table and her account books on the shelf. She told him plainly, without ceremony, the way she did most things, and she watched his face. He went very still for a moment, and then something happened in his expression that she had never seen before, a complete and total opening, as though every guard and every careful containment simply released at once. He stood up from the table and came to her and held her face in his hands and looked at her with those gray eyes wide and warm and said, "Hazel," in a voice that was not quite steady. "It will be spring," she said, "March or April. A year," he said, "almost exactly a year since I came back." She put her hands over his. "Are you all right?" "I am better than I have been in my entire life," he said, and she believed him completely because she knew his voice by now and she knew when he was simply telling the truth. She wrote to her mother-in-law in Missouri, Matthew's mother, who wrote back by return post with a warmth and a practical wisdom that Hazel appreciated enormously. She wrote that she hoped Hazel was keeping up her strength and her work because the worst thing a woman could do when expecting was to stop being herself, advice that Hazel found entirely sensible. The autumn was good. The cattle sold well at market, and the winter feed was fully covered without any difficulty, which had a particular satisfaction given that the difficulty of the previous year's feed calculation was the reason she had entered the shooting competition at all. The circle of it pleased her. The Territorial Fair came around again in late August and they went, she and Matthew and Bessie's husband, who turned out to be considerably more pleasant without his brother visiting. They walked the fairgrounds together and ate roasted corn and looked at the livestock and the crafts and the agricultural displays, and when they came to the shooting competition booth, Hazel looked at the sign and looked at Matthew. "Are you going to enter?" he asked. "Not this year," she said, settling her hand on her stomach in the slight automatic gesture of a woman who is beginning to be aware of a new life in her. "Next year." She looked at him with a long, level look. "Every year," she said. He smiled. "Good." They walked past the shooting line and she could see a few people recognizing her, the woman who had won the year before, and she held her head exactly as she always had, straight and steady, and Matthew walked beside her with his hand at her back, not possessive and not protective but present, which was all she wanted. The winter came again, this one different from the last, with the house fuller than it had been for the previous season. Bessie came and went more frequently as the cold deepened, drawn by the prospect of the spring baby and by the simple pleasure of company. Matthew was home nearly every evening as the county survey work slowed in the cold months, and he spent the evenings at his drafting table, and she spent hers reading or doing the ranch accounts, and the house was warm and quiet and good. He finished a quilt that winter which surprised her, a patchwork quilt in blues and greens that he had been working on quietly in the evenings for months, cutting and sewing with the same careful precision he brought to his maps. She had not known he could sew. He said his mother had taught him. He presented it to her one evening without ceremony, simply folded it and handed it to her, and said it was for the baby, and she held it and felt something move in her that was complete and quiet and very deep. The baby came at the end of March, on a cold, bright morning with the new grass already coming in the south pasture, and the sky the particular clear blue of high-altitude spring. Bessie was there, and a doctor from Cimarron who had ridden out the previous day when things began, a good steady man named Dr. Alonso Park, who had practiced medicine in the territory for 15 years and was as unflappable as a stone wall. The baby was a boy. Matthew was outside on the porch when the doctor came to get him, and she heard his footsteps come through the house, quick and then deliberately slower, because he was trying to compose himself before he came through the bedroom door. She saw him at the doorway and she saw his face, and everything he had been containing for 9 months of watchful and loving attention came up all at once in his expression, and he came to the bed and sat on the edge of it and looked at the small red-faced bundle in her arms. "Hello," he said to the baby very softly. "He needs a name," Hazel said. She had thought about this a great deal and had an idea. "I thought maybe Daniel," Matthew said. "My father's name." She looked at her husband and then at the baby. "Daniel Matthew Walden," she said. "Hello, Daniel." Matthew put his large, careful hand on the baby's head, so gently, with the same touch she imagined his father had used inside the mechanism of an intricate clock, attending to the thing that mattered. Daniel Matthew Walden grew through the summer, and the following spring with the robust, single-minded energy of a healthy child. And the house and the property grew with him, absorbing his presence the way a landscape absorbs new water. Matthew carried him in a sling across his chest when he worked at the drafting table, and Daniel slept against his heartbeat and studied the survey maps with the wide, unfocused attention of very young children who find everything equally interesting. Hazel resumed the full management of the cattle operation 6 weeks after Daniel's birth, which was possibly earlier than Dr. Park would have recommended if she had asked him, which she had not. Matthew took the early morning shift with Daniel without being asked, and she found him most mornings standing in the kitchen in the pale pre-dawn light with the baby in one arm and his coffee in the other hand, looking out at the property through the window with an expression of quiet contentment. She entered the shooting competition at the Territorial Fair again that August, and she won it again. The crowd was larger this time, because word had spread, and the silence when her name was announced was of a slightly different quality than the previous years, less astonishment and more something that lived on the border between respect and the beginning of understanding. Matthew was in the crowd this time, not at the back but near the front, with Daniel asleep against his shoulder in the sling, and he clapped for her with one hand against his leg, the only hand he had free, steady, deliberate taps, and she saw him immediately and held his gaze for one long moment, and felt the whole impossible year between this August and the last August contained in that look. Ed Craddock came to the property in October of that year with his hat in his hands and a less belligerent expression than she had ever seen on him, and he told her that he was having trouble on the East Range and asked if they would consider a revised grazing agreement. Matthew was home and came to the door, and Hazel conducted the entire negotiation herself, with Matthew standing to the side with his arms crossed and his expression neutral, and she drafted the agreement terms and Craddock signed them, and afterward Craddock shook Matthew's hand and then, somewhat awkwardly, shook Hazel's, and she accepted it without making anything of the difficulty it had clearly cost him. When Craddock was gone, Matthew said, "Well done." "He will be a decent neighbor from now on," she said, watching the road from the window. "People generally can be when they understand what the situation actually is." 2 years after their marriage, the county asked Matthew to take on the supervision of the full territorial survey project, which was a significant promotion and would require more travel within the territory. He came home with the letter from the county and put it on the table, and they talked about it the way they talked about everything important, plainly and carefully, and with complete honesty. The additional travel concerned her. Not because she could not manage without him, she had demonstrated that conclusively, but because she had grown accustomed to having him home in the evenings, and she did not wish to be unaccustomed again. "The project is 2 years," he said, "after which the work would be largely administrative, based in Cimarron minimal travel. 2 years of more absence and then permanent stability," she said. "Yes, and the salary is considerably better." He paused. "I would like to take it, but I want to be honest that I am also hesitant to take it. Because of the travel," she said, "because I do not want to be away from you and Daniel more than I need to be, but also because the work matters. County surveying matters for land rights, for the people in this territory who need their claims properly documented." He looked at his hands on the table. "The Apache land boundaries have been misrepresented in survey records for years. If I have oversight of the full project, I can correct that. I have been corresponding with some people at the Territorial Land Office about it." She looked at him. This was the quality of him that she had come to love most completely, that the things he cared about were real and the reasons he cared about them were honest. "Take it," she said. "Are you certain?" "I am always certain when I decide something," she said, which was true. "Write to me often, come home when you can, do the work that needs doing." He reached across the table and took her hand. She added after a moment, "And next summer, if your travel permits it, I want you in the crowd at the shooting competition." "Front row," he said. "You were front row last year." "I will be front row every year for the rest of my life," he said, and she believed him, and the belief was good and clean and exactly what she needed it to be. The following years settled into the shape of a good life, which is not the same as an easy life but is considerably more valuable. Matthew's territorial survey work took him away for weeks at a time in the summer months and kept him home in the winters, and Hazel managed the cattle operation and the property with the same focused competence she had always brought to it, better now for having Matthew's income supplementing the ranch accounts and allowing her to expand the herd modestly and to replace the north pasture fence entirely. She established a small account at the Cimarron Bank in her own name, from the winnings of 3 consecutive Territorial Fair shooting competitions, and from the sale of a prize bull who had served his purpose admirably. This was not because she did not trust Matthew or their shared finances, but because she had learned the practical value of resources that were specifically hers, and Matthew understood this without requiring explanation. Daniel grew into a bright, watchful boy who had his father's eyes and his mother's jaw, and his own particular quality of attending to the world, with a gravity that was charming in a small child. He followed Hazel around the property from the age of 3, learning the cattle by name before he could reliably recall the names of his parents' adult friends. He sat at Matthew's knee, while Matthew worked on his maps and asked questions about the contour lines with a focused interest that was almost professionally serious. A daughter came when Daniel was 4, born in a June that was warm and lavender-scented from the wild plants along the creek, and they named her Clara Rose, the middle name for Thomas Doyle's mother, who had been kind to Hazel in the first years of her first marriage. Clara was different from Daniel in the way that siblings differ, louder and more externally expressive, quick to laughter and quick to indignation, with her father's thoughtfulness packaged in her mother's directness. Matthew was home for Clara's birth and held her within 5 minutes of her arrival in the world, sitting in the chair by the bedroom window with this small new person in his arms and his face doing that thing it had done with Daniel, that complete and unguarded opening that made him look younger and older at the same time. "She looks like you," he said to Hazel. "She looks like a person who has just been born," Hazel said, with affectionate practicality. "Ask me in a month what she looks like." She looked like both of them, eventually, and entirely like herself. The life on the property was good. The kitchen table was the center of it, the place where accounts were reviewed and maps were spread, and children did lessons and arguments were had and resolved, and meals were eaten and letters were written. In the winter evenings the lamp burned late, and there was always the sound of someone working or reading or talking, and the house held it all with the solid presence of a structure that has been lived in well. Bessie Carpenter remained a constant, coming and going from the property with the comfortable frequency of someone who had made herself indispensable through sheer affectionate persistence. Her husband, whose name was Robert, turned out to be genuinely good company when his brother was not visiting, and the 4 of them developed the easy social rhythm of people whose lives had grown comfortable with each other. Matthew finished the Territorial Survey oversight work in the 2 years he had predicted, and the resulting survey records were the most accurate and comprehensive the Territory had ever produced. He had, as he had hoped, corrected several years of inaccurate documentation of Apache land boundaries, working through channels that were slow and frustrating, and occasionally obstructed by people who had reasons to prefer the inaccuracies. He had been patient and methodical and had documented everything and had eventually prevailed, which gave him a satisfaction that he was not outwardly demonstrative about, but that Hazel could see clearly when he came home with the final certified records. "You did what you said you were going to do," she said. "It matters," he said. "The land remembers the way that Ute Elder said, but the records need to say what the land knows." She loved him very much in that moment, which was not unusual, but she felt it with particular clarity, and she told him so directly, because she was not the kind of person who left important things unsaid. The shooting competition became an annual tradition that people came specifically to watch. By the 4th year, Hazel's participation was so well established that the fair's organizing committee had to expand the event to accommodate the crowds it drew. She won 4 of the first 5 years, and came second in the 5th to a young woman named Grace Torres from Las Vegas, New Mexico, who was 19, and handled a rifle with a natural grace that Hazel recognized and admired and told her so directly. They became correspondents afterward, Grace writing to ask about technique and Hazel writing back with the kind of detailed, practical advice that her own father had given her, because she believed in passing useful things forward. Daniel, by the time he was 7, was showing signs of his mother's marksmanship ability, and she began teaching him the way her father had taught her, with patience and clarity and without any shortcuts. Matthew watched these lessons from the porch with the expression of a man observing something he knows is important, and occasionally Clara would pull herself up onto the porch railing beside him and watch too with her serious 6-year-old attention. One evening in the fall, when Daniel was 9 and Clara was 5, and the property was settled for the winter and the accounts were balanced, and the cattle were fat from a good summer, Hazel sat on the porch in the last warm evening of the season with Matthew beside her and the children inside, and the stars coming out over the New Mexico landscape. She thought, as she often did in quiet moments, about the particular chain of events that had brought her here. A widow with 40 acres and a rifle and a 25-cent entry fee. A man at the back of a crowd with his hands coming together slowly, deliberately, because he had decided it was the right thing to do and was entirely comfortable having made that decision alone. "What are you thinking about?" Matthew asked. He knew her silences by now, their various qualities. "August 3 years ago," she said. "The first one, the fair. You were standing all the way at the back," she said. "I could barely see you." "I was late," he said. "I had been held up at the supply store." "If you had been on time, you would have been in the middle of the crowd and I might not have seen you." He considered this. "I was late because the storekeeper wanted to talk about the drought conditions and I did not want to be rude. So I married you because the storekeeper was worried about the drought," she said. He laughed, that real laugh she loved. "That is one way to account for it." She leaned against his shoulder. "I think about what I was then," she said. "That morning, getting up and doing the chores and going to the fair with Bessie and not expecting anything. Not expecting $12 even. Not expecting anything at all. And you found $12 and a surveyor," he said. "I won $12, she corrected, because she was always precise about these things. "And then later I found a surveyor." He put his arm around her. The evening light was going amber at the edge of the western hills, the last of the warm season, and it would be cold tomorrow, and she would have to think about the fence on the east pasture and the winter water supply, and a dozen other practical things that made up the substance of the life she had built. But right now, she sat on the porch with her husband's arm around her, and the children's voices coming from inside the house, and the stars appearing one by one over the ridge. And the feeling that moved through her was something she might have called contentment if that word were not so small for what she meant. It was the feeling of a life that was hers, fully and completely hers, earned and chosen and tended with care, and of a person beside her who understood that and valued it and had never once tried to take the shape of it away from her. "Matthew," she said. "Hazel, I am glad you clapped." She felt him smile against her hair. "I will always clap," he said, "every single time." She covered his hand with hers and the evening settled around them, and inside the house their children's voices rose and fell in that familiar beloved music, and the stars were very bright over the New Mexico hills, and the land stretched out in all directions around their home, wide and old and entirely real, holding the shape of everything they had built within it. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.